Welcome back, y'all, to another episode of General Ed Kids Deserve Geography 2. Today, we've got part one of a two-part series on some really excellent and important stuff to know about abolitionist geography, redlining, white flight, and gentrification. I'm joined today by a very special guest, a longtime friend of mine, T. Troutman. Here is a former Atlanta organizer, Black geographer, and is currently pursuing her PhD in Minnesota?
Yeah, University of Minnesota,
right?
Twin Cities.
Right on. And you are 3 years in?
Yeah, this is my third year. I mean, being the pandemic cohort, it feels very weird saying third year. Like I'm literally the student that didn't know I had an office or a mailbox until 3 weeks ago. But, you know, it's great.
Was that mailbox full of stuff?
Well, no, I actually just had the professor I TA for. She gave an in-person exam for the first time in 2 years. And it was handwritten by students. And so, you know, got to grade my first handwritten exam, I think, ever in grad school. So it's very interesting to be back to normal.
Yeah, whatever that means in those sort of contexts. So we've known each other for about 6 years, 7 years, something like that, out in these mean streets of Atlanta. Dealing with this sort of stuff, and white flight and gentrification is, I don't want to say a defining issue, but definitely has big impact and is very measurable in the context of the city and education here. What are you working on in terms of, you know, the pursuit of your doctorate?
Well, I mean, the short version, the dissertation is on Atlanta. It is a critique of sort of the long history of Atlanta, and it's a critique of Marxist urban geography and the understanding that, you know, it's just production forces that reproduce sort of social, these social relations, right, of oppression. And so a lot of people think if we just abolish capitalism, then anti-Black violence goes with it. And so my argument is like actually in the making of Atlanta and what we understand to be its New South urbanism, there is first and foremost always a reproduction of the plantation social relation, that is the relation of mastery and slavery, that structures the racial compromise that we call the city too busy to hate, shaking hands with the Black Mecca to keep reproducing the Atlanta we know. And so I'm arguing that we can't disembarkate the plantation from the urban, which is to say the urban may be, you know, this sort of decisive move away or this dominance over the agrarian mode of production. But we can't reduce the plantation to simply an agrarian mode of production because its social relations of anti-Black violence and mastery and slavery are inherent to the reproduction of the urban as we know it. So I know that's pretty dense and pretty heavy, but that's sort of the theoretical underpinning of how I sort of reread the history of race in the city, particularly anti-Blackness in the city, to think about the urban, you know, in general. But I think Atlanta is such a quintessential model for understanding the way that structures of anti-Black violence, that is mastery and slavery, must hold in order for us to produce what is considered to be a modern phenomenon, which in this case is a city and an urban process.
Especially, imagine in a field where there is such inundation of the sort of white male urbanist who thinks that if you just move it to the city, that all these other things are going to somehow take care of themselves. And I won't name any organizations, but there's definitely quite a few out there who are really, it sounds like, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, it's that sort of rebuking of the nonsense around class over race warfare.
Absolutely. And I would say it's more capacious than that because I'm an Afro-pessimist scholar. And so, you know, we hold that the world itself and all of its sort of levels of scale makes itself over and against Black exclusion, but not just exclusion in the sort of everyday material sense, but like ontological exclusion from being. And so if you're a subject that doesn't get access to even being or human being, then how do you have access to claim a right to a city, right? In the Lefebvrean term, like you don't have a right to humanity. So how do you have a right to a city, right? Or you don't have a right to humanity. You don't have ontological being as a human. So then how would one's demand for change or demand for a revolution, demand for abolition shift, right? One may be demanding, let's say, the abolition of the city itself and not necessarily like the systems that structure it. And I'm also interested in the violence of inclusion and compromise because Atlanta, like a lot of other cities, are structured on this sort of fine line between constant compromise and constant demands for inclusion. And if we think, a lot of people, I think, in policy planning and the sort of more practical fields of geography in and of itself, think that if we just diversify, if we just include, if we just increase inclusion to what we understand to be human thriving, well, then it solves all these other problems. And I'm like, well, equity isn't your issue. I mean, it is your issue, but we have to think about who is fundamentally barred from being to then even understand why even the most capacious of equity framework can't account for the particular type of violence and suffering that is required of Blackness and Black people to produce these structures. So it's more than just saying, oh yeah, like racism makes things uneven, so to like put everybody on legal or the same footing, then we must make these sort of legal and social changes. It's like, well, there's a reason those keep failing, and they constantly keep failing Black people, and not only failing Black people, but producing and reproducing a certain type of violence and suffering that allows for non-Black humans to progress and enjoy the sort of things that an inclusion might afford. And so, yeah, I know it's like pretty deep and theoretical, but I'm saying all this to say that, history shows us that all these attempts fail, and here's how and here's why. And so it's an alternative reading of Blackness and the city to understand the role of anti-Blackness, the long delay of the plantation, and the reproduction of the New South.
Holy shit. And that's how you
and
get your
that's how
doctorate.
you do it, right? So it's a lot of like theory and reading. I mean, I tell people all the time, like, it's not that I'm not concerned with current trends in urban planning and policy anymore, but they're just my object of critique at this point. I've jumped sort of head off into the philosophy and the philosophy waters, because it's the only way that I know how to unpack and think through the very real trauma, violence, and suffering that I endured as a citizen of Atlanta, but also as an organizer, right? You don't fight for that many years on the front lines of that many, important struggles in the city regarding Black spaces and Black residents, and then fail, right? We fought the law and the law won, without sort of, I guess, trying to find a deeper way of understanding, like, maybe it's not our tactics, maybe it's not the fight in and of itself, but it's something deeper. And so I've been finding a bit of, I don't want to call it, I guess you can call it comfort, right? In knowing that, like, not only did I won't say we did our best and woo, but like, there's a reason, there's deeper reasons why, I guess, like, we could never sort of cross that hurdle.
We did the best with what we had, or what we knew at that time.
But I think we owe a lot more to ourselves to think more critically about these things in retrospect, considering the fact that the city is still making and remaking itself off of the culture of Black struggle. And it's like, it's not even in the interest. It could never, well, let's back it up. A violent oppression carceral state, right, can't make good on the demands of the people, right, without reinventing sort of systems of violence, carcerality, and surveillance in and of itself. And then when you add the sort of layer of anti-Blackness onto it, well, it's like, not only do we want you to fight, we need you to fight. Because the only way that we know not just what freedom is, but what repression should look like, right, is, in and through struggle. And so it's not to say don't struggle, but it is to remind us of the stakes of struggle, that struggle in and of itself is already co-opted before we can even imagine what it looks like. And I think we have to be honest with that. And as a former organizer who is followed by a lot of organizers, I want us to be honest.
And that can be really hard to do, especially when we're talking, all those things you listed there, carcerality and violence, are deeply innervated with the very construction of cities and space and place, and our spatial relationships to them. So what was, do you feel comfortable talking a little bit about your process, how you arrived there? Because, those sorts of experiences really change perception, and what information is valuable and what systems are valuable. We've all touched the NGO industrial complex in some manner, form or another, self included. And you were a geographer for the city, right? For the city of Atlanta for a little while.
Well, I did a lot of freelance work as an organizer while I was in my master's program at Georgia State. So at GSU, I started in the public policy program and, sort of moved through the different classes and things of that nature. And it was something about my experience in the streets and sort of in the everyday on the ground with people, both as a protester and somebody doing direct action, but also the everyday sort of policy research that went into, constructing a long-term social justice campaign, right? So when we were fighting for Tent City in the sort of MPUV struggles, the Proctor Creek watershed things, the Entrenchment Creek watershed things, the anti-Gilly movements, right? The anti-Beltline protests, the anti-Gulch protests. We've done so many, right? I think I got this deep-seated feeling that in trying to remedy these crises, we're creating more crises, right? And I started to interrogate, maybe doing the work is part of the problem. Because if you get pissed enough to launch into uprising and you begin to articulate clear demands from a already violent state, and the state says, okay, well, we'll close the city jail, or maybe we'll offer you some community benefits. Well, that requires us to do the work. They put us on task forces. They give us little resources to go form an organization, to build a board, to go get funding, to get invited to cute little funders' dinners. And we're constantly doing the work. And when you're doing the work, what are you not doing? Uprising. And so I think back on the 2016 moment in particular, looking in the eye of the then mayor, right, Kasim Reed and other state officials, knowing that they were scared and shook. We were a problem in the streets, but they smiled at us and offered us a seat at the table because they knew as long as we had something to fight for or work to do, that is a worthy sort of distraction, right? And so in retrospect, I look back at a lot of the work and I'm like, how often are we going to settle for doing the work when we could actually be making revolution? And I'm just very much in the interest of abolition as the abolition of the terms of order, and not just these systems that can reproduce themselves if we keep the world intact, right? And so I think I've just come to a deeper level of understanding, thinking back through all the little intricacies of all those campaigns and all of the exhaustion that comes with it. I'm a person who, went through some pretty serious mental health issues in the aftermath of a lot of that. I was one of those organizers who, in fighting against gentrification, was literally displaced. I was one of those, they love to throw around, oh, Fulton County has the highest eviction rate in the country. Yeah, one of those evicted people was me. You know what I'm saying? And it's wait a minute, I'm living in a world where this is my lived experience, or where I go to Atlanta City Council to see Oscar Kane Jr.'s mother, crying before City Council. And the only remedy that the council can offer a grieving mother whose son has been murdered by APD is more funding for the police so that they can get better technology for their gun holsters. So when they draw their guns, the body cam comes on, because the issue here is the body cam, not the murdered Black person. I can remember sitting in City Hall that day and being like, I can't do this anymore. I can't do the work anymore. And I need a deeper understanding as to why, no matter how much we fight and how much work we do, it seems like we end up back at square one instead of pushing forward. And the only thing that does get pushed forward, I think, is the very neoliberal ruse that the city likes to put on to call itself progressive, to say that, look, we had these issues and we did this to solve it. And it's well, nothing ever got solved, but you figured out how to craft a narrative. And so I think poking holes in those narratives, but also being honest again in our work about the stakes of the work is sort of where I land. And so I'm hyper skeptical, I think, of being so on the ground and constantly fighting and advocating for things without a critical analysis. Like I can no longer advocate, and this was, even in the streets, I would always raise points like I can't advocate for transit expansion as an abolitionist, knowing that expanding MARTA also means an expansion of MARTA police. I can't ask for a more inclusive area around the Beltline when, regardless of where the Beltline goes, it brings with it surveillance cameras and policing. When we're talking about, say, scooters, right? The scooters on the sidewalk or whatever. Well, passing a no scooter on the sidewalk ordinance in a Black neighborhood that's already over police means who's more likely to be policed for being on a scooter on the sidewalk, despite these also being the neighborhoods with no infrastructure for them to safely move about. I think at that level. And then at an even deeper level, like, why does policy in and of itself, why does planning in and of itself have to be structured around reproducing carcerality? And so I affectionately, whenever I type the word policy, I put the E in parentheses, police E, right? Because policies in and of itself, systems of what we call care in and of themselves, a lot of times require we police ourselves and others for that to fit and for that to hold. And so again, I'm just always the person in the room that's like, we need a little bit more nuance before we can launch into, demands and, build out a scope of work for us to get to.
Wow. Again, it's so easy to fall into controlled opposition before you realize that you're like, oh, I'm actually totally controlled here. In the sort of theatrics of chasing your tail, if you will. And ultimately, like, that these functions of geography can help us deeper understanding of that, and to parsing out, like you said, being more honest about these sorts of things.
Absolutely.
So then I guess, because these are big questions, and these are the sorts of things like I'm not necessarily presenting to ninth graders right away, but it does bring up the sorts of things like, if the foundational vocabulary and elements, and I always harp on back on this, and I'm sure you agree, like, when you deny people the vocabulary to talk about something, you deny them the ladder to further step up to deeper understanding and those sorts of things. And I'm just thinking about, like, how lost we are, and many people are, for such a long time. You end up chasing you just trying to figure out how to say what your problem is before you can even get into these sort of deep understandings and the critical literacy required to examine, expansion of MARTA. Like, how many people, when you say expansion of MARTA, it's like, yeah, absolutely. People have been fighting for that for decades without realizing that you might be fighting for something harmful along the way too. Got my MARTA map up here.
Oh, I peeped. Yeah,
absolutely. That and the 2020 census sign I stole out the park too.
We love reclamation. No,
yes, they left it there. They were littering. I like that. That's good. Yeah, it's a lot. I'm sure you're familiar with the joke that let's form a committee is academia's version of thoughts and prayers.
No, absolutely. And I think at the city advocacy level is also, let's get on a task force. And I'm like, yep, as soon as I hear the task force word, boy, have we lost the plot.
Bye-bye. Yeah, it's a thing. And we talked about displacement, and we often advocate for these things because advocates are often the people, and these words have come kind of dirty to us: advocate, activists, all these sorts of things. They're loaded, are often the people being most impacted by gentrification and the legacy of white flight, and those sorts of things, and how that impacts your ability to even do that work. And especially since at least the kids I was teaching, a lot of them are the legacy of the beneficiaries of all this sort of stuff. And they don't know that, right? They're 15. They're not really literate in that material. But kind of brings back, talking about task force and schooling, that how are you going to talk about trying to be more inclusive and build relationships among struggling demographics in the education system, while stripping them out of the education system itself, to remove those sorts of things. Because many of them, the teacher standing in front of them can no longer afford to live in the city. And even the places I could afford, I'm like, but those are not my neighborhoods. And am I ultimately participating in further displacement of lower income Black folk or Latinx folks, even if I myself am kind of broke? It's just part of how it goes.
Absolutely. And I think, I know your program is talking about high school students, but I think it's really important because as somebody who's transitioning into being an educator in the higher ed space, right, at the university level, I am TAing, and this is my third semester TAing, a course called Globalization, where we talk about colonialism, neocolonialism, and neoliberal capitalism are the, big themes, and like tying them all together. 1492 is directly connected to our current neoliberal moment, and it can't be disembarkated. And so, we look at everything from, again, Columbus to Scramble for Africa, oppression in the Caribbean, post-colonial movements, and then also like the making of modern cities, and violence and racialized violence in urban planning, and sort of the making of our global spatiality because of the sort of neoliberal demands of globalization that are structured onto race and class issues. And so conceptually, it's a dense course, but week to week, it's funny that this is, the redlining conversation. I just, in our last class meeting, began our conversation on redlining. And these are university students ages 18 to 20, most of them are first and second year students. A lot of them, most of them are from the Minnesota suburbs, not the Twin Cities. And they have sort of understandings of the city as like this scary place and the place around the university. You should have your head on a swivel. And I'm like sitting here laughing because I'm like, child, I lived in the West End and Sweet Auburn. Like I walk around the neighborhood like nothing's going on up here in Minnesota. But that's neither here nor there. But and having students just watch so we did a 6-minute video on redlining. What is redlining from YouTube? And they listened to a 50-minute podcast because we were talking about planning in the New Deal city and Keynesianism before we got into the neoliberal city. So they listened to something on Robert Moses, New York and the New Deal city. And then we went into the actual Twin Cities redlining maps, which I'm not too familiar with the racial and class dynamics, like the actual, geography of the Twin Cities. I've only been here since 2020. And this is the sort of first year that I've been sort of outside and can see the city. But the students know where the things are, right? The places you don't go, the desirable spaces, they know. And so watching them interact with the maps themselves and saying, oh my goodness, like everything that they said about Black people in these areas, or everything that they say about migrants in these areas, everything they say about refugee communities in these areas are also connected to this sort of long history of redlining and, government or federal government policing of literally where we can live and be. And then even learning about white flight, you're saying like these students are beneficiary or descendants of the beneficiaries. A lot of the students had that sort of, and I'm not religious, but they had the come to Jesus moment, right? Where they're like, oh my gosh, like this is why I live in the suburbs. And so I think me as in my more theoretical work, I mean, just like Afro-pessimism teaches me that the world, Blackness in the world, slavery in the world is this sort of relational dynamic. I look at things like the suburb and the city as a similar paradigm, right? Where it's like, for me, where there's a Negro, there's a slum. And that's not just me, that's thinking with Frantz Fanon, right? Fanon teaches us that Negrophobia incites this anxiety and peril that doesn't just structure things like the lost cause and the KKK, but also like our zoning code, right? Atlanta literally urbanizes or comes online as a city that experiences rapid growth in the post-emancipation moment. And with post-emancipation, it's like, okay, so these same slaves that, were supposed to be loyal to us because of slavery, but also incites this like peril of all the myths that are imposed upon Black people, are now moving into our cities and are about to live next door to us. We can't make that happen. And so again, when I'm like, there must be a reproduction of this plantation social structure that then conditions the possibility of an urbanism in and of itself, like we never actually get away from that. And so every time we think we're recreating or modernizing the city by trying to make urban processes more even, which we know urbanism under capitalism is already uneven. And when you add racism and anti-indigeneity, anti-Blackness on top of it, wow, like we can't even begin to form the language of an even development.
What does that even mean? What does that look like?
I think you're very right in saying like teaching students not just to look at the phenomenon, but to have the sort of language to name that, like I can then say something like, where there's a Negro, there's a slum, right? And no matter if it's a Black suburb, right, or a Black, urban ghetto, um, or, a literal slum, right, maybe somewhere in the global South or something, like they all serve the same relational dynamic to producing spaces of vitality and thriving. And so at a theoretical level, I'm even asking questions of like, say, sustainability and environmentalism, like, well, in order for something to be a green city, it can't be Black. The urban can't stand in for Black anymore if it's to be green, because Blackness is antithetical to living and thriving. And yes, this doesn't negate, our long history of sort of Black resilience, right? We're put in these spaces of environmental degradation and lack, and somehow our communities still survive. But I also think that's a parasitic model of resilience, to put Black folks in the middle and say, look, these people have gardens. Yeah, because we don't have food, right? So, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's one thing to try to make Black spaces and lifeways sort of hyper visible as a sort of means of interrogating, our problems, whether they be hyper visible for the bad things like exclusion and segregation and racist zoning histories and redlining, or in a quote unquote positive light for the sort of mutual aid-esque, absence of the state, community infrastructures that Black folks have to rely on, because again, the state's not going to serve you. I think that's Negrophobia and Negrophilia to me. Black, the hatred of Blackness and the pretending to love Blackness doing the same work. And so I think, I think arming students with the language to not just look at the sort of inclusive, I guess, paradigms of suffering, like say neoliberalism or, globalization or things of that nature. But like when we get into the nuance of things and we're talking about anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity relative to the making of geography itself, none of these terms that we're preoccupied with overturning comes online without those constant reproductions of the violence that comes with, a slave society in a settler colonial state, because we haven't moved past those things. And I don't think without getting that story clear, we can begin to discuss what we consider to be our very real contemporary issues. And so I take that seriously as an educator, because without geography in schools, right, which is what you're advocating for, students come to college and it's like, well, I got to blow the cap off your head in multiple different ways. And, over the course of a couple months, I see you once a week. But, maybe we can get to the meat of the things and the heart of the things.
And what would that look like if these kids already came in literate about it when they are 18? How much further you could go. And you can absolutely phrase everything that you said in a way that is accessible to maybe someone who hasn't had that foundational stuff. You can take the roots out of that. I really have to sit with that bit you said there about how urban has been a stand-in for Black, and that Black and green just seem to be at odds. I have to sit with that. That blew my mind right there.
That's you asked me what I'm working on now, and I'm working on sort of an interrogation of Henri Lefebvre, and but thinking about the Situationist and a lot of other right to the city-esque literature, and thinking about what they're calling for an end to the sort of capitalist paradigm and like human overcoming until we get to the sort of more inclusive city, the city that is not segregated or doesn't rely on alienation in the Marxist terms. I'm like, yeah, but I'm Black, and some of us have to be excluded, like in order for these terms to come online. And so displacement to me is not just material, or it's not just a policy problem or a planning problem. It's an ontological problem. It's a problem of being itself. Like, what must be excluded so this other stuff comes online? And again, I think if Blackness has always come to stand in as the antithesis to thriving or vitality, the things that we associate with sustainability itself, well, then we have a problem. And again, it goes back to what you were saying. Like, I just start with the terms. What does sustainable mean? What does anti-Blackness mean? Like, when we put them together, they're very much at odds. And I don't think you square that by some cute policy proposals and some project attempts. Trust me, I've attempted the projects and I've written the proposals. And we got a much greener Atlanta than we had 25 years ago. But we got a lot less Black Atlanta than we had 25 years ago. And this is not just a matter of policy, it's something deeper.
You are gonna love Immer Gluck's book, which you're supposed to. You should have it by the end of the week. I was checking the tracking before.
Actually, when we get back to school after the break, his book talk that he did on the New Books Network is made my syllabus for the globalization class, because we're talking gentrification, and I always use Atlanta as my object of analysis. I know I'm teaching in the Twin Cities, but again, I know nothing about it. But if we talk about, Tanya Washington and the Dardens, I was on the front lines with them for 6 years. And my students asked the other day, well, T, how did they just, remove Black people, to build a highway or something? Eminent domain. Here's a story about eminent domain. You know what I mean? And it's so, I think it's lovely that there are educators in the room like us with organizing experience who are not just talking about things we've read in books or maybe covered to write an academic paper, but we were on the ground struggling and watched residents and supported residents literally use every tool at their disposal and new tools that were donated and given to them to go fight these battles and to still ultimately come up with not their homes. Do we concede or do we really look at this as, again, this is something deeper than the unfairness or the unevenness of city planning and policy under capitalism, right?
In fact, I'm glad you brought her up because I think it was last November, actually, it was a year ago. There was a TikTok going around of Tanya Washington speaking to Fox 5, Atlanta Fox 5, about that sort of thing. And I use that in the classroom, and the kids are asking the same questions, which is good because I also would teach civics in the second semester, so I could talk about eminent domain more than once. But the sort of, blowing the lids off their heads, what do you mean the city can just decide to justify that you don't get to believe there? And the sort of irony and the dichotomy here that, we talked about displacement and gentrification and the sort of flipping the roles. Now, the people who are, are coming back that you have to live next to, who are probably not thrilled to do so, or only pleased to live next to you in ways that you are pleasing to them. And then having to end up, it's almost reversed. Now, the dispossessed are ending up in the suburbs, and the sort of impact of it doesn't, in the suburbs being these sort of low density volume spread out places and what that does to your ability to move. But living in the city didn't matter either, because when you could move, you talk about policing, it's one way or the other, it's still inhibiting the freedom of movement and those sort of human geographies there and how we get from one place to the next, and some people more than others.
Again, thinking about suburb versus city, and Blackness standing in for slumness, i.e., the specter of Blackness, the fact that, again, going back to Frantz Fanon, he's like, the way Negrophobia works, you actually don't need to have Blackness present to incite the anxiety that produces these paradigms like segregation, exclusionary zoning, right? It's only its possibility of being present. So if we were to pass a city ordinance tomorrow that says Black people can now move here, we're going to help Black people move into these spaces, well, the terms of separation themselves, lose their meaning, right? What does value even mean now if the suburb is now where Blackness is, i.e., so now we see, and I forget the scholar who wrote on the slum burb, but there's a whole little sub discourse in urban geography and suburban urban geography, I guess, where they talk about the slum burb phenomenon, this blackening and browning of a suburb. And I'm like, well, yeah, of course it works the same or in a very similar way as segregated urban neighborhoods, because in blackening the suburbs, you make the city even more desirable for capital, for whiteness, for things that are associated with vitality and life making. Because where a space is blackened, that's already written off. We don't need a redlining map to show us that, but the redlining map does affirm it. And it's so simple. I mean, it's things as simple, and I like to use, real world examples when I'm talking to students. For years and years and years, when urban spaces are Black and we're trying to build healthy cities and healthy environments, we're like, we must eliminate fast food and liquor stores. Okay. So then white people move in and we get gourmet burger spots and breweries. I'd rather have McDonald's in my liquor store. Like,
So
and it's
many.
like, and the monoculture is wild. I'm like, there's only so many burgers I can eat and sour beers I can try. But at the end of the day, it's still a liquor store and a fast food spot. We've just whitened it and convinced ourselves that this is something to be desired, over and against that, what we've already associated with Blackness. And it's, as Deshaun Harrison puts it in their book, Belly of the Beast, Anti-Blackness, Politics of Anti-Blackness as Anti-Fatness. What is health to Blackness? It's not possible. Blackness and health are at odds with each other. We actually construct what we understand to be health and healthiness over and against not just fatness, but Blackness and fatness, right? Or the non-desire to be either. And so again, that's Deshaun taking a very, not to be a pun here, but like hefty, theoretical slash at the way those things are mutually constituted. But I think the way that they are drawing out desirability and anti-Blackness has major implications for how we think the spatial, because a lot of times where we choose to locate, especially white folks in capital, right? Let's be honest, they're not going to locate anywhere that's supposed to be declining unless they think they're going to have a flip in their speculative return on investment. They move there off speculation alone, unless the things that bar people from thriving are already established as such. And so when you look at a gentrifying neighborhood, again, it's so much deeper than who we do and don't want to live next to, but like, what is our psychic sort of unconscious anxieties that crop up next to living in close vicinity or close proximity to certain folks? And then in the, sort of extension of that, like, how does that unsettle these terms like the suburban or the urban? When, the suburbs are where Playboy Cardi and Lil Yachty come from now, and not necessarily the city. It's funny. I have to explain to students what public housing is. I mean, and again, I use Atlanta.
We're getting to that next generation where they're further enough away. What used to be normal to us, like in terms of what we needed to know, they have no idea because it hasn't existed.
Atlanta's last public housing projects fell my senior year of high school. So if we're talking high school kids, right? I've been out of high school 11 years at this point, so this is a whole generation of students who have lived in cities with no true bricks projects where we know that's where the Black folks are in the hood, producing hood culture, right? And so to me now, it's like not Blackness. It's not that Blackness doesn't even have to be present, but Black spaces don't, because the culture has sort of moved beyond the need for a literal material urban presence that we, call place, right? We don't have to have Black places anymore because we have Black culture in the sort of stand-in for it. But then we continue to associate Black culture with urban culture. And we know in our gentrified age or whatever, well, the urban has completely gentrified itself at the level of like the term and the sign itself, the sign and the signifier itself. When we think urban now, do we think Blackness? When we think of urban communities, urban neighborhoods, urbanisms, right? Do we think Blackness first anymore? And I think that's worth interrogating, that in our material displacement, we've also sort of uncovered a necessary displacement at the level of meaning itself. And again, I don't think that's too much for students to consider if we're teaching these topics piece by piece, week to week, because I've watched my students go from, what do you mean by globalization, to making these points before I make them. So, I don't think it's a matter of what you teach. I mean, it is a matter of what you teach, but daring to teach it, and to not police ourselves so that our students might actually learn something and not go out and, just on a whim, try to save the world without the I think, proper tools, to ask sort of nuanced questions of the work that they're trying to do.
And even in the sense, to the extent that people do, it's often the sort of Blackness that non-Black people feel comfortable donning.
Oh, yeah.
In that regard. And you brought the McDonald's, being replaced by a burger joint, and the corner store being the package store being replaced by a brewery, how many of them are actually on top of where the actual previous liquor store used to be? And in that regard, it reminds me a lot of my trip. Minister, I've been through Palestine several times to the West Bank, and that Israeli settlers do the same thing to displaced Palestinian villages and then call it the same thing in Hebrew. And the expectation is that you would never even have considered that something happened
Absolutely.
or changed.
Yeah, and it's like, structures of anti-Black violence is literally the blueprint for all other structures of violence and oppression that happen writ large. Like, Blackness is the ultimate other. It's everybody's other, right? But also these sort of these violences that we associate with just global terror, right? Even if you use Israel and Palestine, like there is a paradigm of white supremacy that Zionism learns from in a very particular way. And it's not that, they're strangers to that, right? This is, if you look at that story, this is happening at the same time as, empires in general, right? The British Empire and the other global empires of Europe are shook in the post-World War moment, while at the same time, structures of urbanism and structures of global development and other sort of big abstract things are not just reinventing themselves, but reinventing new technologies of anti-Black violence. I think we can't look at things like settler colonialism writ large, or we can't look at phenomenon like anti-migrant policies and borders and things of that nature without thinking about the way anti-Black violence structures the unconscious psyche of the human world, and then allows for technologies like policing of mobility to preempt there be a border, to then that being a technology that we can use and deploy around the world. Operation Gilly teaches us that, Gilly teaches us that. Who's over policed in America? And where do they take those practices? And then what practices do they pick up in apartheid Israel and bring back over here to police and inflict terror upon the already alienated and segregated Black communities? And so that's something way deeper than holding a neoliberal university like Georgia State accountable for overseeing this program, or trying to ask for a police reform where maybe we train our police officers here. Well, that necessitates something like a cop city if we want to train more cops here, versus sending them overseas to apartheid Israel. So it's like even our solutions have been limited by the anti-Black psyche, right? There's some part, I think, of all humans that desire safety and desire it over and against Black alienation and Black segregation, or something of a term for Black exclusion, right? That comes online in these forms that I absolutely understand to be offered as a source of borrowing for all other structures of violence globally. If you can keep Blackness out, you can keep other things out as well. The blueprint is always laid.
And that is also, I forget who was saying it, it might have been on the Bird site, someone talking about they're not preparing to provide more water and food as climate change becomes more disastrous. They're preparing to move certain people out, and which is why for so many, like the destruction of one of the 4 major forests in Atlanta is perfectly acceptable for a police training facility. I'm so glad you brought up Gilly. For those of you who don't know, Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, where officers, especially in Georgia, but all over the Southeast, exchange with police officers, Israeli police officers on drug interdiction and counterterrorism, and how that's implemented into political geography, the politics of place, and where those boundaries are. Definitely.
Yeah, and when you talk about intelligence, right? Like we've watched, for example, like since Atlanta hit its sort of like beltlining turn, not just the increase in policing, like more police boots on the ground, but we know APIG-D has invested its bloated, funds into surveillance and intelligence. And so you look at, say, a 2020 protest versus that of 2014, 2016, versus that of Occupy, versus that of the student movements of the 90s and the 60s and things of that nature, right? Because Atlanta has this long history of protests and sort of social justice that it, stands on, and that structures its progress narrative, right? I think that expansion of surveillance and intelligence is super important, and the points sort of make itself, like, as the city has whitened, as the demographic, not just the demographic makeup, but I think the spatial makeup too, by extension, right, has shifted. It goes hand in hand with the way that the city has increased its capacity to not just, police on foot or police in cars, but to have our doors kicked before we even get to the level of escalation, because they're so heavily invested in surveillance and intelligence technology. I mean, I'm no expert on surveillance and intelligence, but I would be curious to see the nature of state repression, given this sort of bloated investment in those types of policing tactics, right? And you think about that and the ongoing sort of Gilly thing. I mean, there are layers on top of layers here. And it's not saying that it makes it impossible for you to revolt, but it almost invites it, because the state is already geared up, right? They get the tanks out a lot quicker now. They get the cars out a lot quicker now. They get the dogs out a lot quicker now. And that's because they're able to think ahead of us. And so it's not just new tactics and strategies on our end, but it's also forcing us to interrogate the way carcerality reinvents itself and advances its technology a lot faster than we can even fathom.
Correct me if I'm wrong, if this is still the case, but I believe Atlanta is the most surveilled city in America and is on the top 10 list of most surveilled cities in the world, and is the only city in the U.S. on that list. I don't know if that is still the case.
I would have to look that up, but honestly, I wouldn't be surprised, because I think about when the Beltline poured its concrete in the West End, like how the cameras came before people's capacity to walk on it. They made sure they had those cameras. And I was just, I could never sort of get past that. And it's like, yeah, we're inviting everybody to enjoy this quote unquote public amenity, but we know who's being watched on those cameras. We know what activity is being surveilled. And I think, I do trap work. I look at Black culture, but especially hip hop culture. The YSL RICO case cannot be disimbricated from this expansion of Atlanta's surveillance and sort of intelligence apparatus. And so a demand to to sort of abolish the police or to abolish policing in Atlanta has very real implications, not just for the people, but for the culture itself. That when the city needs to appear to be cracking down on law and order, they go get the people that the kids actually look up to, that actually quells Black rebellion in what remains to be Black spaces, right? Which is not your political figure. The youth aren't following a proverbial Martin Luther King or a Maynard Jackson. They following Lil Baby, right? They're following Young Thug, you know what I'm saying? And I think it's very interesting that Lil Baby has become a superstar in his co-opted protest, after his co-opted protest song from 2020, while Thug and Gunna, who, put a bunch of money toward bailing everybody out of Rice Street, are locked up underneath the jail. And it goes hand in hand with the way that policing and carcerality has, again, advanced its technologies. Even the culture's not safe. And that is arguably Atlanta's biggest Black export at this time.
Ooh. Whoa. And like what, I don't even want to say intersection. I want to say crash of like human geography and cultural geography. These cultures are being shifted out in the same trajectories, the same paths that the demographics are. We were talking about suburbs and exurbs and all that stuff. Like everything goes. It's not just a group of people. It's all the place and the culture and what the values that come there.
And I think it's
you didn't get one of the babies buy one get one tickets.
LOL. Never, you would never catch me at a baby show. Little baby, maybe, but not a baby. And I mean, I think too, while we're on this topic, it's interesting. I took a seminar at GSU. I think it was my last year of my master's program, where Dr. J.P. Addy and David Awaniak in the Urban Studies Institute co-taught a course on defining the urban. Like, what do people from different disciplines define as the urban, and how do they approach urban issues? It was really important, or really, really important course to me, thinking about urban studies more theoretically, but also across disciplinarity. But they themed the course The City at Night, and we had a lot of conversations about having a mayor of the nighttime, so a night mayor, and sort of having a governance council over nighttime activities as cities urbanize, or not urbanize, but like expand and sort of expand their cultural landscapes. And under Andre Dickens, we've gotten a nighttime policing and governance apparatus, which has directly impacted those last really Black places in the cities. What clubs and bars and lounges that still exist for Black folks are the object of scrutiny. And I think, this coming on the heels of a new wave of incited Negrophobic peril after 2020, where it was like, these people are lawless, they're tearing up Buckhead, Buckhead wants to leave, let's expand policing to sort of remedy this. Well, I mean, you can't disembarkate that from, Buckhead Buckhead Village, right? Where Black bars and hip hop bars were in Buckhead, and then they got bulldozed and they put a Tom Ford where that stands. And you can't associate these very lily white spaces of vitality where investment is supposed to be most favorable. It can't be blackened. And I think seeing that at a higher level of scale right now, where you have a Black mayor invested in over policing Black culture, what remains of it, right? Because most of the clubs and bars that I frequented as a GSU student are gone. A lot of the strip clubs that are marquees and rap songs are gone. A lot of, streets and neighborhoods that animate our favorite hip hop songs from Atlanta are gone. And I say gone by they're literally gone, like closed or name changed, or the name is there, but the people are not. And I think connecting these long histories, when if we're to talk about abolition geography, we first need to talk about the nature of its carcerality. And so we can't know what we're abolishing and seeking to undo if we don't know the current conditions, but not just the current conditions, like the long durée of those conditions and how they're going to continue to reproduce themselves. And so I'm not interested in an abolitionist geography that is redemptive, right? That says, like, if we fix holes in the state, or if we invent a new state, or if we invent a new social or urban apparatus that is antithetical to this one, or in some way anti-carceral, we still have to watch ourselves, because we become the police in very real ways too. We'll just as easily say, well, what's so wrong with having somebody over nightlife? Because I don't want to live next to those hookah bars, right? Or they do be shooting outside of those music studios. And so it's very interesting that on the one hand, you see rappers being integrated into the political apparatus of the city as sort of extensions of the state, to bring in the unruly Black youth that still remain in the city, their followers. But by the same token, these same rappers who come out with the mayor during a protest and tell us to get in the house now have to fight the new mayor, who they helped get elected, to keep their bar open, to keep their restaurant open, and to not be subject to the same technologies of policing as the rappers and hip hop communities that came before them. So again, whether you're talking about rich or poor, I think where Blackness is, the state invents repression. It reinvents its technologies of carcerality. And I think until we deal with the nature of anti-Blackness in the production of carcerality, and understanding that there's a necessary production and reproduction of that, that then as residue impacts everybody else, we'll keep chasing our tails.
Would you say, this is kind of, I'm just putting this together here as you're talking, and it's kind of a broad statement. Would you say lack of geographic literacy and all those things ultimately creates more snitches?
I think so, but then also, I mean, I can't.
Like what you're talking about, I think of, because one of the big things I would teach in geography is do a unit on genocide studies, whether it was in somewhere in West Africa or East Europe. And I just think of how not knowing those things allows youth to ultimately become played by those very apparatuses and tools that we're talking about, that they're willing to snitch on people that ultimately puts people in violence's way. And that has been my fear, it's things that came to mind as you were talking there.
And I mean, the fracturing of community, if we're talking about displacement, is at the heart of that. Because who teaches youth when you don't have that intergenerational presence anymore? If you're just a Black kid who lives here because this is the one place your mom can afford or where her voucher's taken, you're not being honed and living in a community, which is why I ultimately think like these Black cultural spaces or these sort of hoods where the rappers come from are prime targets, because they're some of the last places where that sort of intergenerational thing exists. We're sort of at the death knell of that. The gentrification is always like, wow, I can't believe that they're putting that there. These people want to live here. But like looking at it in Atlanta, it's like, no, like I literally cannot believe you're paying $500,000 or whatever for a home off Mason Turner because you want to walk to a park. That is wild to me. And it's like, I couldn't even fathom that. But also you have to factor in like that has happened now. I mean, we get to this point over like multiple 10-year, 5-year intervals of displacement, to the point where like what we understand to be community and culture can't even take hold and sustain itself because of the constant fracturing, the constant moving in. And I think that's something inherent not just to the carcerality of the city, but again, like the anti-Blackness that structures what we understand to be the carceral and the segregation in and of itself.
Woo! All right, we could do this forever. You are brilliant, have so much to say, and there's so many questions there. I want to give you the opportunity to, if there's anything else you feel like you need to wrap up here, I want to shift to how do we teach kids in high school geography these sort of foundational elements to be able to someday arrive at these sorts of discussions and ideas? So is there anything else that you didn't get asked that you wanted to talk about? And at the end, we'll make sure we'll link your Patreon and all that stuff.
Absolutely. No, I think we covered the bases, but I do want to talk about your pedagogy question. I mean, I think where we win in these conversations is by keeping the material relevant, right? Like I'm not a Gen Zer, but I also am a social media manager, right? And I used to work at Wear Your Voice, which is a feminist publication, right? And a lot of our audience are Gen Z radical feminists of color, right? And so having to make content that educates them also informs how I teach my Gen Z students in a college classroom. And so when I'm teaching neoliberalism, I'm like, okay, so a new season of The Crown is out on Netflix. Who's watching that? Like, who's watching Narcos Mexico? That episode about NAFTA? Exactly. Or like, okay, like who saw this festival? Like Atlanta has become this like festival city. Why do we have a seltzer festival? I don't know, because white people want it. But it's things of that nature.
What the fuck is that? We have a seltzer festival?
I don't know. It was a pre-pandemic. I think it was like in Piedmont Park. I want to say, like, I remember walking past it. But anyway, yeah, I mean, everything from brunch festivals to, multiple music festivals. Like, students know that that's what's happening in their communities around them. And I think that's always a good jumping point, right? Or if they hear something like Cop City, start there, right? You can teach a whole semester off of the things that lead up to that point. So I think for me, like, dense terms only matter when they're most relevant, when I can not necessarily like see myself in it, right? Because, it's a different thing when white students, for example, realize why they live in the suburbs. But there's a very real everydayness where I teach students, like, we're talking about neoliberal capitalism and globalization. Like, it's all around you, and you don't have to watch CNBC and adopt the language of the stock market to understand what we mean by a neoliberal capitalist phenomenon. And so I keep things as relevant as possible. You know, I live in Minneapolis. Students want to talk about the George Floyd incident and its aftermath, and equipping students not just with the knowledge of what it did and didn't do, but also like the structural necessity of producing the spectacle of anti-Black violence and murder at that level is not too far-fetched, because students have Twitter, students have TikTok. They're already using that language, and a lot of times they ask me questions in those terms. So I also think between being relevant, but also listening to students, because a lot of times, I mean, you know, I have a rough lesson plan, but I go off what students want to learn. Yeah, we're talking about redlining, but we have also had a 20-minute discussion about eminent domain, because students want to know what eminent domain is. We're in a college room. I ask students, I'm like, you know what? Somebody Google it. Somebody Googles the term and we can have the conversation. And so I think listening to students, because class should be a dialogue, not a talking at students. And so I think relevant material and being intentional about dialogue is how we get serious about pedagogy and taking seriously teaching students the nuance in these terms that they need to not just be good students, but, you know, organizers and hell raisers, because, you know, we need them to be that.
Absolutely. I don't even know what I want to, like, there's a lot of things I want to say that, so that I can show you, I wanted to show you some of the ways that I've initiated those, at least among ninth graders. And, you know, you mentioned they have access to social media, and something that's always blown me away, even teaching ninth and 10th graders, they have, you're a couple of years younger than me, right? I graduated in high school in 2004. I'm 36. But it always blows my mind how these kids have access to the discourse way earlier than we did. Like, they're familiar with the terms. They might not be able to navigate it all, but I'm like, how the hell did you know that already? I had to go to the library. I had to have someone in my life help me, you know, tell me that sort of thing. You know, so they're ready. So in that regard, this would be my introduction to the white flight gentrification elements, you know, using the Georgia standards on the top here. But I was also educated by Dr. Goldie Muhammad, who would also break down things into the four pursuits, you know, education as a form of liberation. And you have the skill, that's the thing they're going to do. The intellect is the thing they're going to learn about. The identity is how they're going to take it into their own life. And the criticality is, you know, is the critical theory. How are we breaking it down? What is the inequity and what is the humanization or dehumanization within the work itself? So these are the questions I start off with, and I make it pretty clear to them. These are big questions for adults too. What if you could no longer afford to live in the neighborhood you do now? How far would you have to move to be assigned to a new school? And we talk about the other adjacent high schools in the area, like how many blocks over would you have to move to go to, say, I can't think of the name of the high schools right now, but the next one over to the east, west, north, or south. And of course, the big one here, a lot of them are maybe not familiar with class as a concept, but they do know, for those who do know, it revolves around income levels. And we try to make clear that, you know, that's not it. So often ask the question, how do you measure your wealth levels? How do you measure class? Things, not just your income level, but if you lost your job tomorrow, would you drop a class? You know, where do we stand on that ladder? Land, property ownership, and the sorts of home equity issues that come with it. Your network, who you know, and the jobs that you get. I don't know if you saw New York Times reported on somebody else's research about a month or two ago about how cross-class relationships have impact on social mobility, which is often within the framework of, you know, capital and gatekeeping and someone, you know, being willing to give you their resources so that you can step up with them. But, you know, you talk about, this is the dialogue we have usually for the first 10, 15 minutes or so.
And I think like the first 15, 20 minutes of dialogue in any class are the most important. I often open my classes, I give general announcements and give students the opportunity to ask me whatever question about flow of the course and grades in the syllabus or whatever. But I jumped right into, okay, we watched the Pruitt-Igoe myth. What are your general reactions? We watched the shock doctrine. What are your general reactions? And in that, you get students who watch, say, like I said, Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, which I teach outside of the professor's standard syllabus in my discussion section, because I want students to understand that neoliberal capitalism and globalization isn't just a market system or something that can feed off of and reproduce, things like racism. But if you are drawing it all the way back to slavery and settler colonial violence, or i.e. the Columbus moment to present, like, students need to associate it with violence, right? They need to know that, the war in Iraq or the way that Hurricane Katrina was quote unquote mismanaged, right? That these sort of things don't just come online without the very real structures that come before it. I'm actually really excited. Students are we're ending with Katrina in our conversation, and I'm doing 2 weeks on Katrina. And it's also really interesting. You talk about aging. None of my students remember Katrina as like a major part of their life. And I'm like, wow, I went to school with people who were displaced from Katrina and yeah, literally.
Climate refugees.
And then even that, I caution the term refugee, especially when we're talking about Blackness, because refugee and Blackness together, right, incites a whole different type of peril when we talk about anti-Blackness and Black mobility, which are conversations we begin to have too if students raise the point of, oh my gosh, whether the documentary showed that all these people got dispersed. Well, what happened? Well, in the same way that, they called in the National Guard because of alleged looting, which is just policing anti-Blackness in the city, that sort of specter of fear followed folks who were displaced from New Orleans, wherever they went. I know for a fact in high school, those kids were excluded or bullied in a very particular way because of where they came from and what they survived. But it goes beyond that because, again, they incite the same sort of anxiety that causes the high school bully to react a certain way at a higher level to city planners, policing systems, and the neighbors that they come to live next to. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like, it's not just a matter of, okay, class is income based, but like, what is associated? I guess how do we structure like anti-Black violence or anti-indigeneity or these sort of ideas of otherness, not just based on myths, but how the myths recreate themselves by something as simple as there's a natural disaster and people are displaced and they have to move. Those are the conversations that you allow yourself to have by even putting, a class antagonism as the sort of subject of the discussion in and of itself.
And they are antagonized when you question some of these things, for sure. Especially some of these, I don't even want to just say the white burbs kids, because a lot of them are like interested in hearing it, especially like the closer to the city you are. It'd be different if I was teaching in Gwinnett County or up in Cobb County, maybe. So in how, those communities say in New Orleans, why certain communities were abandoned, Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about organized abandonment. And they often align with redlining. So this is the first word I give them, and this is 1938 Atlanta. The school I worked with is a little bit off the map here, but I remember the first time I talked about this, and a young Black girl was like, "What do you mean where they were allowed to live?" Yeah, girl, you couldn't get a loan. That wasn't how that worked. What's the book? Yeah. I know you've read Color of Law before as well. But this lesson is essentially built off of both of those books. So we talk about that. I just added Dan's book as well, Professor Irma Gluck there, White Flight, The Atlanta and Making Modern Conservatism. We make sure they get the first day. I do really White Flight is the focus for the first day or two, and then we come around for gentrification at the end, which is actually the next episode that I did when I interviewed Professor Irma Gluck. So they go over that. I actually did this when I had a Chromebook. The first year we were doing online schooling, I said, I'm not going to draw this on the board every semester. But ultimately to walk them through the White Flight process of 1950s, everything from real estate agitation and class, the creation of resegregation, making those phone calls. I heard Black people moving into your neighborhood. Do you want me to sell your house for you? Our wealth metrics, how we value those or don't value those. and ultimately how white flight was a block by block sort of thing, the lower income houses being on the end there. And then as they were broken, then Kevin Cruz, Professor Kevin Cruz talks a lot about how these sort of the flimsiness of community among white flighters. And, you break one block, everyone else flees to resegregation. The impact on middle-class Black mobility and, what's it mean to buy a house for more than it's worth, leaving you with less to make those repairs. And what does that do to the value of the home and overcrowding, because now all those property taxes went with, the wealthier white folks who left because they don't like to share. And I know there's been a lot of hubbub on social media about third spaces recently. Your eyes just rolled out the window there.
As soon as it happened, I was like, oh my God, I get it. It was my face.
Okay, here. All those sorts of things. Oh, and to bring up, because a lot of kids don't know that property taxes are what fund public schools. And there's a whole set of conversations to be had there.
I've taught a bit of Ewing's book, Ghosts in the Schoolyard, where she talks about the politics of school closure under Rahm Emanuel and the sort of neoliberal regimes of in Chicago. She talks about institutional mourning and that sort of withering away of neighborhood fabrics through the abolition of, or the state's, I guess, sort of displacement or abolition of what we consider to be the sort of natural third spaces of our community. So that's like why my eyes roll, because I'm like, third spaces get branded as a certain like cool thing, but like in reality, especially in Black communities, things like our schools and our churches and our meeting spaces, right, have always been a quote unquote third and fourth space. But the violence of gentrification is that typically a lot of times institutions go first, which then allows for the housing to be fair game. I mean, it doesn't always happen that way, but I think, Ewing presents a very important way of looking at it, that like when the schools die, the neighborhoods soon follow. And then that presents the opportunity, obviously, for similar trends of remaking. So I think it's white flight at a different level of scale. This is at the institutional level, right? We're not talking about houses, but we're talking about institutions being removed.
Let me write that into my lesson plan here. Not just housing, but institutions as well. Institutional loss. So we have that dialogue that goes on for a bit there, to varying degrees. You talk about these kids, the light bulb goes off and the question marks that, wait, it really works like this. So in terms of the skill set, I have them do some primary source map analysis, geography class, and we love our maps. So I give them a couple of different MARTA maps, from the current one to the different proposals in the past. I think this first one is 1967. Talk about the history of MARTA. When was the first bus? When was the first train? When did I-285 and the major highways that make up Atlanta come to be? And what is the impact on development or de-development of certain communities and, where that happens? And this actually ends up being the task that they do in class. But before we do that, this link here, I actually give them an excerpt from Kevin Cruz's book about the relationships between reversing, like the suburbs proliferated as Atlanta, the city, stagnated and lost a whole lot of population. Talking about how people say they're from Atlanta, but they're not from Atlanta. It might be your mailing address, but you're not from the city, kid. You're from the suburbs of DeKalb County. And there's some check for understanding questions along the way, but ultimately that any and all resistance to the expansion of MARTA has always been deeply rooted in anti-Blackness and the inability for people to move. And depending on how ambitious the class is, I try to bring up, a lot of those places that initially fought against MARTA expansion are actually a lot more diverse today.
Where the advocates are. Yeah.
And, the upper Black middle, but also like the conflict with the Black upper middle class too. I know some people refer to Atlanta as a regime, rich Black, rich white, often at the expense of poor Black and Latinx constituents. What does it mean for the concept of supremacy and racism and classism if the ideas that were constructed by pointy white hoods and the impact is still on the same population is also being proliferated by something other than white demographics. Because I think it was in 2018 or 2019, there was another vote on MARTA expansion. And it's a lot of the, it's upper middle class across the board has really come to say, no, we don't want that. For the same reasons that white segregationists did.
I was definitely living with my parents in Gwinnett County in 2019 when they had the county level vote to expand MARTA. It was so interesting because when I got displaced from the West End, I had to live with my parents for 6 months and still go to GSU and work 2 jobs in the city. And I took the commuter buses every day. Like I drove 15 minutes, I think, from my parents' house to Sugarloaf Mills and took that commuter bus into the city, got off at, one of the downtown stops, either Sweet Auburn or Civic Center MARTA station, and, had a breeze card and a bike and got around, almost, with relative ease. But there's a lot of students who don't even realize, especially in Metro Atlanta, that transit expands in that way. And I think from a transit advocacy standpoint too, I often ask people that are MARTA advocates, do you take the bus? Because that's a different level of orientation to transit. And so I think asking students too, what is your orientation to MARTA? Not just culturally, but how do you perceive accessing it? Because the school that, the school.
A lot of them have never been on a bus.
I came and guest lectured is on a MARTA bus line. But I wonder how many students, are raised to think that is a viable means of transportation, the MARTA bus, not just the train.
I guarantee you none of them know. So actually, I'm glad that you brought that up because that is actually part of the exit ticket, the tasks that they had to do when we give them, the self-audit, the identity portion. So there's 2 tasks that culminates in all this knowledge and discussion you had, where I have them compare those 3 maps. I give them a little template here for the beginning, but I just need you to really define, be clear. Can you read this map and can you read the changes in maps over time? What is in that 1961 map? In this case here, the line out to Smyrna quickly is scrapped. Anything that's going out to Cobb County there. And for them to really articulate their understanding of, what happened, what changed. Or another one is the 1976 map has a plan to go beyond the Dunwoody station, and that's never happened. Or even going beyond the airport. That was never the original intention of the endpoint there. So that's the task I generally have them do in class. But this one, I make them say, go home for a day or 2, pay attention to your neighborhood. Don't use Google to look up your MARTA station. You need to look it up for the train station, but like you said, where you go with the train, it's very different than where you're going with the bus. And a lot of them are like, hey, there's actually a bus stop near my house. There's no bench or anything. It's just a sign. I've probably driven past it 100 times before. And how far is that from your home? And then I do the same thing for an I-285 or I-85 ramp, because like I said, we do talk about a little bit of its history, but also to talk about food deserts and bank deserts. Something that actually I didn't realize, I remember this one time she lived in an exurb. It was a bit further out from the school, but that's also a gross, could you call that a food desert if you live in an exurb where you couldn't get there without a car? But the people out there are super equipped with those resources to get.
So correct me if I'm wrong, and it could have changed in the time since I was super into the food justice space. But there are alternative metrics for food deserts in a rural, suburban and urban sort of environment. But you're right, seeing gentrification and displacement on a more regional scale even complicates, the way we try to neatly bar those sort of access barriers, right? Or the way access looks different across those geographies. Because you're right, when you add a class analysis or racial analysis, well, people of the lower class or of, discriminated groups in general get moved. It doesn't matter which area you sort of get placed in, if you're not equipped with the sort of means of accessing, it doesn't matter what's provided to you if you have no means of accessing. And so is this I think this is important, I should say, because it's forcing us to think doubly, right? Like both from the material geographic differences of access across these sort of spatial arrangements, but then who in these spaces, even given, if we fix it spatially, right? Who still is denied access because of class dynamics, even if we're just chalking class up to income at this point, because we know lower income people, right, have less money for buses, have less money for gas, things of that nature. If you can't afford it, either way it goes, can you access it?
I mean, that's ultimately what I'm asking them to assess, to audit for their own neighborhoods. Do you have access to what you need without a car in your area? Or what's your life like that? And those are the two tasks that I give them for this. And that is my whole introductory lesson for redlining and white flight, for high school geography.
I would love to have your high school geographers in my first year geography courses for sure. Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's crucial that you advocate for this, because I'm getting first through third year undergrads who have no grasp. And I think at the college level, we try to chalk it up to, well, these students aren't in this major, they aren't taking this course for a major requirement. It's sort of a school enforced elective requirement. But I'm like, I don't care what your job is. You need to know what anti-Black violence, anti-indigeneity, settler colonialism, and neoliberal capitalism is, like, period. Like, they're, learning these lessons equips you to move throughout the world. And there's a reason why the sort of, what is the anti-woke, far right, weird, however we're branding them this week, right? The ones that are fighting for book bans on top of their anti-trans and anti-abortion policies, which all directly impact young people, not just the books. Let's be clear on that, not just the books. But there's a reason why these are the things that they are calling for the ban on first. And it's not too far-fetched to think if you read a book on MARTA that takes seriously the race question, that is a banned book. That's banned subject material, subject matter. And that's a very real thing that I think while we should be teaching it, but also we should have the courage to teach it beyond the classroom, or point students into the direction of the continued learning. I don't care, like I said, if you watch a season of Narcos or The Queen, or The Crown, right? The Margaret Thatcher season teaches you what I was going to teach you in class this week, right? And to teach students, to constantly recognize, be it in pop culture or in their built physical environments around them, there's always an opportunity to learn about these concepts. But we have to steer them into that recognition.
Like, how many kids be like, yeah, I'm watching The Crown for, political geography and that sort of thing. Like, a lot of people, they would never even consider. I didn't consider that. I do be seeing it coming up on Twitter and stuff and be like, oh, something's going on here. So maybe I'll check that out. But yeah, it's right in front of it. It's built into the world. It's in the damn school that they're sitting in. Like the populations of the classrooms and the designs of it, or we don't want a third floor on the building because the immediate upper middle class folk around the school are more concerned about their property values and their skyline than they are about being able to have enough damn classrooms for these children sitting in moldy trailers while we get rid of this stuff. All right, we went hard. This is going to the outro here. Where can people find your work? I know you have a Patreon, right? Links
to anything that I've done public facing are also publicly available via Patreon. So, any podcast episode or YouTube video that I've done since I started doing these things is available. My Patreon is Critique, but instead of, spelling it traditionally, it's CRITEA, because my name is T, and then QUE. So when you're spelling the word critique, you get to the T, you put an EA, and it's critique on Patreon.
I will put the link in the description.
And then, of course, you can follow me on
video.
Twitter and Instagram, Trap Tees, and then Critique has an Instagram as well, which is critique with the underscore. But I'll provide you with all the links and the proper spellings of the things, but always open to new followers for sure, especially on Patreon. Open up your purse, Thank you.
I signed up the other day. I did. when I saw it there. Thank you for so much, and just for being brilliant. And even as I say that, it's like, well, sometimes the world forces us to be brilliant about things we'd rather not be, or not have to be. Nonetheless, it is necessary. Thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and all that you have done and will continue to do. Absolutely. Please support them. We'll have those links in there. If you're interested in getting the assignment here, that is the PowerPoint and the readings, that will be available on Teacher Pay Teachers as well. I'll put the link in the description too. And I think that's all we got. Thank you so much again. And remember, general ed kids deserve geography too.